Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I am the host of Relationship and Truth. Today I'm going to be reviewing an article that I found online that unfortunately a lot of people who would call themselves Christians have glommed onto. The reason why I say unfortunately is because this particular article is excessively bad in terms of its understanding of Christianity and especially Christian history. It bothers me when Christians grab a hold of stuff like this because it demonstrates that they don't really care about truth, which is a real shame. We claim to follow the one who is the truth. That's Jesus' claim of himself in, John chapter 14, I think it's verse 6. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me. He claims to be the truth. And so we as Christians, we should be very much so interested in the truth and making sure that what we put forward and what we believe is in fact actually true. Sadly, though, there's a lot of people out there that like to think that what they believe is true, but when it comes right down to it, when you investigate it, when you push on it, it really isn't true. There are standards of truth. And the reason why there are standards of truth is because truth itself is an absolute claim and is not relative. At least you can't believe that if you want to have a meaningful conversation about anything. If truth is relative, then there's no point in having a conversation about anything with anyone. There's no point in having a point if all truth is relative. That is a position that reduces itself to absurdium pretty much instantaneously. No, if truth is going to be meaningful at all, it has to be absolute, and the only way it can be absolute is if there is an absolute basis for it. And that's one of the wonderful things about Christianity, is we actually have that basis. There is no other worldview like biblical Christianity in terms of being able to provide a basis for why there are things like laws of logic and why we can say that something is reasonable or unreasonable in absolute terms. That is something that is unique to the Christian worldview. We have the basis for that in God. Our God is the one who is. He says, I am. In the underlying Hebrew, the name that God uses for himself when he says, I am, is, a lot of times in the modern we would pronounce it as Yahweh. We don't know how it was pronounced in ages past because there were no MP3 files of anyone actually saying the word in ages past, so we don't technically know how it's pronounced. But in the modern we pronounce it Yahweh usually. And it is based on a Hebrew verb that basically means to be. When God says he is Yahweh, when he says I am, he is making a claim of existence. He's saying, I am the one who is. I am the one who can define myself this way. Nothing else in all creation can define itself that way, but I can. I am the one who is in and of myself. I am the self-existent one. Everything else is derived from me. Everything else that you could point to in creation has its origin in something other than itself, that being God. That is what God claims for himself, and that is apparent in the first major section of the Bible called the Pentateuch, or the Torah. The first 5 books of the Bible, they form a functional unit, and in that unit, in fact, even in the first book of the Bible, that term Yahweh gets mentioned, but it's not really explained in a whole lot of detail until you get into the book after that, the book of Exodus, that is actually explained. But right from the beginning, God defines himself in what you might call metaphysical terms. He is making philosophic statements about himself right from the beginning, saying that I am the basis for all things. That's what we have in Christianity that you don't have in any other worldview. If you try to claim something is true from another worldview, the question that immediately should come up is, why is it important that it's true? On what basis do you say that that is important, or even that truth can exist? And most other worldviews fall laughably flat when it comes to those kinds of inquiries. There's some that do a little bit better, but the vast majority of them, whether they be atheistic or pagan or whatever the case happens to be, they fall very flat when it comes to underlying presuppositions as to whether or not absolute claims exist and how can they exist. If you don't have an absolute lawgiver, there cannot be absolute laws, whether they be laws of logic, they will be laws of nature, or laws of morality. You cannot claim any absolute without the absolute behind them. In Christianity, we have that, and that should give us confidence in interacting with any worldview that is out there. There is no worldview that is out there except for Christianity that can actually provide a true and adequate basis for all kinds of knowledge and reasoning. That's in Christianity alone. But sadly, there are many Christians out there who, while believing that what they believe is true and that people should believe what is true, they don't actually think about what that means. And so they go online and they find different things or encounter friends, whatever the case happens to be. But in these days, it's usually online that people do this. They go online and they encounter something that seems interesting to them. And unfortunately, without actually applying any kinds of standards of truth, either standards of truth that would be explicitly or implicitly given in God's Word, the Bible, they instead wind up attaching themselves to things that sound good to them. And a lot of times, things that sound good simply aren't. And you need to be a discriminating, discerning person to figure out what kinds of sources you're dealing with. The way that I heard one person put it, that is accurate to at least a certain extent, is that there are, people who are educated, and I'm not talking about college necessarily. I'm talking about people who have taken the time to look at original source material, and people who critically evaluate the sources that they have in front of them, especially when they're a secondary or tertiary kind of source, something that's making claims, but it isn't the original source material from which those claims come. That's a secondary or tertiary kind of source. They think very critically and very hard about whether or not these kinds of sources are actually trustworthy, and they deal with the original material as much as they can, or at least as much as time will permit and their life will permit, in order to make sure that they don't get taken in by falsehoods. Okay, there's those kinds of people. That's what I'm classifying as educated. I'm not necessarily talking about college or anything like that, but people that are concerned with truth and are very critical of truth claims. And then there are people that are not educated but are internet educated. Now, granted, this can happen in sources that are not on the internet, but like I said, these days that's usually where it is. The internet educated person is someone who has basically clicked around until they found something that they liked, and that's what they start propagating. The critical evaluation of the source, looking into the history and understanding what's going on, looking into different kinds of source material, evaluating this against other standards, etc., doesn't really come into their mind and isn't something that they do. I mean, even the Bible talks about the importance of comparing things. What is it that it says in Proverbs? It says, what a man says sounds good until someone comes along to examine him. And of course, that's given in the context specifically of the law court, of people making claims before a judge, but it holds in other areas of life as well. Just because someone says that it's true doesn't necessarily mean that it is true. I really shouldn't have to say that, but unfortunately we live in an age of rampant ignorance and misinformation, and so I have to say things like that. I have to say that just because you read it somewhere doesn't make it true. And even if it's from someone that for the most part you trust, still doesn't make it true. For example, not too long ago, someone that I would say that at least in general I trust, Dr. James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries, he put out an article related to the current pandemic that frankly he misread. There's really no way around it. He made a claim about what this article said that the article simply did not support. He thought it said one thing when in fact it didn't say that thing, and that was the assertion that he made. And initially I ran with it because I trusted him. Well, Dr. James White, as good as he is in a lot of areas, he is not a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination, just as I am not perfect and no one is. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And because of that, because we're all sinful human beings who are faulted, we suffer the malady of total depravity, which is fancy theological speak for saying that every aspect of a person is tainted by the fall of man in the garden. There's no part of who we are that is perfect anymore. And that includes our intellect. Even when people are trying to be honest, they're still going to make mistakes from time to time, because every part of who we are is fallen and imperfect. And because of that, we always need to be suspicious of people, even people that we generally trust. I didn't do that. I posted his material, and somebody called me on it, and it's like, okay, yeah, you're right. And I had to basically retract the statement, put in a caveat in there about what was wrong. And there was some stuff that he did get right, but not from that article, so had to go back and explain all of that. And that is what truth would obligate a person to do. If you find out that what you did is wrong, you need to change it, and you need to fix the error to the best of your ability. That is what truth combined with the moral ought to believe the truth would lead you to do, and also to propagate truth. Those are a few basic things that every Christian ought to be concerned with. Believing what is true, propagating what is true, and being corrected by what is true. Those are three things that a lot of modern Christians and a lot of modern people in general, but especially what concerns me is a lot of modern Christians don't do. And that's how you'll wind up with people propagating articles like the one that I'm going to show you. So let's get into this article. This article is entitled, "The Vatican Removed 14 Books from the Bible in 1684 with No Real Explanation." Catchy. And this article is found on a blog called the Mind Builders Fellowship, and the tagline is that it is an organization that help each and everyone to liberate themselves by renewing of the mind and flashing out the unwanted elements out of the mind. Super reputable source. It's a blog from someone who obviously has some problems with the whole concept of proofreading, which doesn't necessarily in and of itself mean that what they say is wrong. But if somebody cares about truth, and especially cares about their audience, and making sure that they understand things accurately and correctly, they're probably going to take the time to proofread it or have it proofread. And that is not what was done here in the title of the blog that is going to show up on all of the blog articles and blog posts. So that's not a very good sign, just to begin with. And if you know anything, and this goes back into what I said about people who are educated in the sense that they actually criticize and scrutinize and take the time to actually interact with original material, at least to the best extent that they can, anyone who's actually looked at Christian history recognize what kind of a mentality this blog is coming from. This blog is talking about liberating through a renewing of the mind. Anyone who knows Christian history knows exactly what that is, what that's a form of, what that is a recapitulation of, a reiteration of. That's Gnosticism. Gnosticism is one of the earliest heresies that Orthodox Christians dealt with, and it was basically the idea that the historical reality of Christianity was supplanted by more or less the mental reality of Christianity, although whether or not mental reality would even be appropriate would certainly be a stretch. But essentially, that salvation was through gnosis, special knowledge, coming to understand things that most other people don't have available to them. It wasn't about salvation in the conventional sense. The message of the Gnostics wasn't that you are a sinner in need of a savior. The message of the Gnostics was that you are ignorant and you are in need of knowledge. That is a very, very different gospel from the gospel of the Bible. And that heresy, even though it's never completely caught on and didn't, blossom and bloom to a huge extent, it is still very prevalent even today. It never really died out. And there are a lot of reiterations of it, lots of recapitulations of it, lots of new versions of it that are out there today. And a lot of people encounter it and buy into it, like I said, without a whole lot of critical thought, without a whole lot of critical scrutiny. Alright, so with that said, let's get into the article. The article starts out by saying, typically when the Bible is brought up in conversation, what comes to mind is a source of truth that has not been tampered with. Okay, again, considering your sources, analyzing your sources, who is this talking about? What kind of a person would you expect that to be the assumption in a conversation? Is this something that is geared towards atheists? Is that what atheists think of, that the Bible is a source of truth that has not been tampered with? Guarantee you there's a lot of atheists who would not say that. A lot of atheists like to at least claim, not that it's necessarily true, but they would like to at least claim that the Bible has been tampered with all over the place, and no, it's not true at all, etc., etc. So this statement right here is not meant to appeal to atheists. We can pretty reasonably assume that. And then what about Muslims? Well, Muslims, by and large today, would say that the Bible has indeed been tampered with, and that's why it doesn't agree with their Quran, and doesn't agree with their religion in general, the Hadith and all that kind of thing. So this is not meant to appeal or be relevant to Muslims. Who is it that would believe that the Bible is a source of truth that has not been tampered with? Who would that best describe? That would typically best describe a modern-day Christian who doesn't know a whole lot about history. If you know a whole lot about history, you know that there's lots of people that have, in fact, tried to tamper with the Bible. And that doesn't mean that the truth is unknowable, but it means that there's been lots of people that have tried to obscure the truth. You know that the Bible has been one of the best read books in all history, if not the best read book in all history, but it's also been one of the most hated books in all history, if you know anything, about Christian history. So this is trying to appeal to people that would consider themselves Christians, but are generally fairly ignorant of history. That's going to be a little bit of a problem. This is definitely aiming at a specific group and appealing to a specific group that is decidedly vulnerable. That is going to be vulnerable to misinformation because they don't know the history. And they're not necessarily grounded in the history. Christianity is a historical faith. Whether you like it or not, it's a historical faith. And if you don't know that history, at least in basic outline, and we're not talking about just biblical history, I'm talking about how it has come down to us today. If you don't know that, at least in basic outline, there's lots of things that people will wind up getting caught up with and caught off guard by, at the very least, that we really shouldn't be, and isn't really necessary that people would be vulnerable to that kind of thing. But unfortunately, we don't teach Christian history very much in a lot of modern Christian circles. And so you wind up with groups like this, Gnostic groups, coming along and saying, well, here's what you think, because nobody's ever challenged your beliefs before, and we're going to tell you how it really is. That's Gnosticism. This is the secret truth that nobody else really seems to get or even talk about, but we're in the know, and we're going to make you in the know too. Alright, so then they have a picture of a Bible, and then and I actually find this rather interesting. We're going to look at some old Bibles here in a second. I just find it so interesting that the Bible that they chose here, of course, is a fairly old printing. And like in a lot of old printings of the Bible, the way that they spell things and the very letters that they use are different. For example, this map that it has here, it says, the places specified in the map That's the first little phrase there. And you can look at the word specified here, and you'll see that it has what kind of looks like an F at the front of it. You might have to zoom in to see what I'm talking about here. Let me see if I can actually zoom in for us. No, it did not zoom in that at all. I just made it. Maybe I could bring this up here. And nope, still not letting me zoom in. Okay, well, I will demonstrate it at a later point when we get to that, but my point is that if you look at their picture, and I'll put a link to the this blog down in the description box of the video so you can take a look at the picture in more detail for yourself, but right below the map it says the place is specified in the map, and it spells specified with what looks like an F instead of an S for where the leading S of the word specified should be. And then the word map they spell with an extra P and an E, which we wouldn't do in modern American English. There's variation in how letters are used and how things are spelt that is in this very picture, but that's going to come up later on in the article as being some kind of secret weird thing. But if you just look at the older Bibles in English, you know that that isn't unusual at all. Okay. All right, moving on with the article. It says, however, when this book was originally published, it contained 80 books, and current editions only have 66. And we have to wonder what exact purpose the removal of the 14 books would serve. Well, that is an interesting claim. When this book was originally published, what do you mean by that? You mean the English versions of the Bible? Or do you mean when the Bible was actually first produced? Because it was produced over a period of many, many, many years. 1400, 1500 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. It took a very long time to produce it. It was produced as basically a series of smaller books that kept getting added to until eventually you get the whole thing. So saying that it contained 80 books when it was originally published, if you're actually referring to original language documents, strikes me as more than just a little bit odd. That would not be very accurate or very useful. Because like I said, there was books that were written over a period of time, the collection was added to, until eventually you get to the whole thing, but that took a lot of time. I mean, when it was originally published, if you want to go back to the earliest form of it, it basically would have been one book. The Book of the Law, and it's actually even mentioned in the Bible that the first form that it took was the Book of the Law. Anyone who's read the Bible or aware of how the Bible came to be wouldn't make that claim as far as original unless they're referring to English. That's the only context in which this would make sense. But if you're talking to people who don't understand the broader history and that it was a process of collecting these books until we eventually got to what we have, again, this is something that's going to appeal to people that haven't really thought this through in any major way. But since it's what makes sense the most, we'll assume that this person meant originally published in English. Because historically, like I said, it was one book when it was originally published, and then other books, as prophets of God revealed more material, wound up adding to the collection. And as more prophets revealed God's word, more stuff got added. That's how that worked. So if we're talking about English, when this book was originally published, it contained 80 books, and current editions only have 66. Again, that is somewhat disputable in that there are a lot of early English Bibles. If you're talking about some of the earliest, you might go back to the days of Wycliffe in the 14th century. And for those of you who are a little confused about that, 14th century would be the 1300s AD. The century that you're in and the actual date are basically off a little bit. So 1300s is the 14th century, 1400s is the 15th century, and so on. So back in the 14th century, 1300s, late 1300s, you have the first basically Bible in English But before that, you have at least, say, like things like the Psalms and whatnot being published. And of course, they weren't published in their entirety. It's just the Psalms. It's not the rest of the books. And there were a lot of English Bibles that were first published in New Testament form before the whole thing was done. Famously, for example, we have the Tyndale New Testament, which was literally just the New Testament to begin with, and then eventually Tyndale translated a few more books of the Old Testament, and then he was martyred, and then other people kind of picked up his material and kind of completed what he was doing, and it wound up being the Matthew's Bible by the time that it was done. So again, even if you want to put it down into being the statement being a claim about it being originally published in English, even then it's not very accurate. This is someone who's just simply not aware of history, of how the Bible came to be, how the Bible came to be in English. This is just ignorant. It really is. But let's say we get to the point in English history where we do actually have complete Bibles of both the Old and the New Testament that are meant to represent a complete Bible and not just the Psalms or not just the New Testament. In those cases, yes, most of the Bibles that would be put forward in English at the time would have had basically 80 books. There's a little bit of debate about how you would count certain of them, but basically 80 books. And nowadays, our Bibles that we usually have as Protestants, not other groups, but as Protestants, generally only have 66. And so what that would mean is that there were more or less 14 books that were removed. And that is a legitimate question. Why is it that we have fewer books in most modern English translations than we have in a lot of the earlier English translations? That actually is a legitimate question. The surrounding material and the way that it's phrased isn't overly accurate, but it does get at an important question, and that is, you can look at English Bibles that come from the past. They have more books than we have in most of our English translations as Protestants today. Okay, that part is legitimate. Saying that this is a question of originally published doesn't really work if you're talking about the original languages, because in the original languages it was something that got added to and added to and added to over time. You have first prophet giving first revelation, first book being made from that, and then the other prophets came along adding their material, and so on and so forth, until finally the last prophets, Jesus Christ, came, and that ended the canon. So it doesn't really work for original, and it doesn't really even work for original in English, because like I said, there were English versions of the Psalms, or at least some Psalms that were put out fairly early on. And then a lot of the English translations were done New Testament first and that kind of thing. So there's some very major holes in what is being said, but the whole question of why do we have more books in these early English translations than we do in most modern English translations, especially those that are made for Protestants, that is a very relevant question. That's not what was actually said, but I get the concern. And it's a concern that a lot of people are going to have when they first encounter this information. Oh, Bibles used to be published with other books that we don't have in there right now? Well, that is really curious. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this blogger's explanation for why these books were removed. This blogger says that the Vatican Church, or Roman Catholic Church, let's just stop there for a second. The Vatican Church. Again, in that whole being critical thing that I talked about before, and comparing things, I would just ask you, who else talks about the Vatican Church? Is that actually a term that's actually been used to any great extent in history? I mean, seriously, who calls the Roman Catholic Church the Vatican Church? I don't think I've met a single Roman Catholic that ever referred to themselves that way. And even a lot of other groups that would interact with them, like, say, Protestants or the Eastern Orthodox, or even Muslims and pagans and atheists, the vast majority of them, well, every single one that I've heard, has not referred to them as the Vatican Church. That is not a term that has any historical or cultural significance, and yet this person is using that term. Why? Most likely, it's being used out of ignorance. They think the Vatican itself has some secret special importance, and so they use that as their determinative marker. And this is pretty common with most Gnostic groups, is they'll take certain words, attach a special amount of emphasis to them, and make everything about that. Even if it's not historically meaningful at all, that's what they'll do. So, just pointing that out. All right, getting back into it, this person says, the Vatican Church, or Roman Catholic Church, has been associated with deception for ages. Claim, no reference, and I'm not defending Roman Catholicism at all. I am a Reformed Christian, I'm a Protestant, and because of that, yeah, I don't agree with them. But at the same time, if you're going to make a claim, you do need to back it up. Okay, and this is a claim of deception. Okay, what were the deceptions and how can you prove it? Now, there were deceptions that the Roman Catholic Church was involved in. For example, something that you could look at and you could investigate would be the papal decretals. There was a series of decretals that were put out basically in the Middle Ages that were meant to justify the position of the Pope. And they were falsified. They were false papal decretals. That actually is a deception that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was guilty of perpetuating. That's something that you can actually look up and investigate for yourself. But just simply claiming that they're a deceptive group without a proof of deception, or at least something to look at regarding deception, is really a meaningless thing to do. Now, granted, this is a blog, and so, okay, we can forgive a certain amount of informality there, but again, for us as critical Christian readers, we should look at that and say, okay, here's this claim. Do they give us a source? Do they give us an incident that we can examine for ourselves? What's the case? Nothing given. All right, and then this person, seemingly trying to support their claim that that the Roman Catholic Church is involved in deception, starts mentioning atrocities. They say their atrocities have ranged from genocide many centuries ago against the Cathars to child molestation in, actually, this person says is, more recent years. The child molestation issue is something that's fairly common knowledge, so I'll grant you that. But again, this person is made the claim of deception for ages, and the only thing that's fairly common knowledge in the here and now is the child molestation that's going on in the here and now. So that's not ages. And then the claim is deception, but the other example that they give that's not modern, but is in fact fairly old, something that could be considered age-long, is the actions of the Roman Catholics against the Cathars. Is that necessarily a deception, though? And to give you a little bit of history there, for people who are not aware of the Cathars were another Gnostic group that popped up in history. Like I said, Gnosticism is something that Christianity has been dealing with for a very long time. A bunch of people that say, well, there's all that stuff that, you can investigate in history books and you can learn the history, and there's what the Bible actually says on the face of it. But there's this secret knowledge. If you look at it this way with one eye kind of squinted and you think about this and we associate these random words, let's really focus in on the word Vatican and let's really focus on the word enlightenment, and we put those two together and we see all these special connections. Those kinds of people have existed in every age, and the Cathars were one of those groups of people. Now, you might disagree with the stance of the Roman Catholics regarding the Cathars in basically exterminating them, at least when they could. Although, to a certain extent, some of the things that they did were not quite as drastic as they could have been, but that's a discussion for another time. But it is very fair to say that the Roman Catholic Church dealt with them and pretty much every other heretical group quite harshly. Roman Catholic Church existed within the system of sacralism for some time. Sacralism is the governmental system that basically weds the church to the state. And the combination of church and state acting together means that everyone who is ideologically and theologically suspect is also criminal in the eyes of the state. And that was the way that it was for literally thousands of years. Sacralism is not anything that is new. It strikes us as strange, but it was not new in the age in which the Cathars were being basically exterminated, at least their belief system exterminated as much as possible. But to say that that extermination was a deception by the Roman Catholic Church is a grave misgiving. It's not like we don't know what the Cathars believe. They were Gnostics. The Roman Catholics weren't being deceptive about that. They were saying, this is what you guys believe by your own admission, and we don't agree with you. You guys are heretics, and because we're in a sacred society, heretics are enemies of the church and the state, and therefore you're going to be executed for your heretical beliefs. Whether you agree with that way of doing things or not, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't being deceptive about it. Here's your beliefs. Here's the Orthodox beliefs. The two aren't the same. We're going to act on that. That's not deception. A lot of people like to claim that about themselves, and myself as a Reformed Christian, I'm definitely not a fan of Roman Catholics because they killed a lot of our guys to begin with, whether it be the Huguenots, whether it be martyrs like William Tyndale, etc., etc. The list could go on. There's lots of people that they killed on my side. But just because I don't like them doesn't mean that I'm going to accuse them of being deceptive if they actually weren't. Actually, there were a lot of Roman Catholics that understood what the Protestants were saying, what the Reformed Christians were saying very accurately, and they didn't agree with it. And you can find very accurate reflections of Protestant beliefs in Roman Catholic documents. For example, in the Council of Trent, which was basically a reaction to Reformed Christianity, you get some very accurate statements about what Protestants believe. It's on the Roman Catholic side, it's basically in the denials. We deny that this belief is true, but that belief is oftentimes very reflective, very accurately reflective of what Protestants actually believed. How's the Roman Catholic Church done deceptive things? Like I mentioned, the decretals in favor of papal authority. Yep, those are lies. Child molestation in the modern that has been covered up. Those are lies. But the actions that they took against the Cathars, no, those are pretty straightforward and honest. This, again, is just not very aware of history and is using defenses that aren't very accurate. Like I said, I'm no fan of the Roman Catholic Church, but call a spade and make sure that the things that you're putting forward are actually accurate. There are ways to prove that, yes, that they have done deceptive things, but that doesn't mean that everything they do is deceptive. And if they happen to not like your guys, because this is very obviously a blog that takes a Gnostic view, and of course they're going to sympathize with the Cathars, that doesn't mean that they're being deceptive in that particular case. They were deceptive in other cases, like I said, trying to gain support for the position of the Pope in the Church. That was definitely a deceptive process. 100%. But that doesn't mean that they were deceptive regarding the Cathars. And as much as I don't like that they outright killed, and it even happens today in certain places, like northern India, for example, there's a pretty heavy Catholic influence in northern India, and there are a lot of Protestants who get killed in northern India by Catholics. That kind of thing still happens even in the modern age, unfortunately. But just because they're against my people, as it were, doesn't mean that they were necessarily deceptive regarding my people. Like I said, in the Council of Trent, you will find a lot of very accurate statements about what Protestants believe. Okay, doesn't mean that they were being deceptive about us. There's other things that they're deceptive about, but that doesn't mean that they're deceptive regarding your group. The author of this blog, who obviously takes a Gnostic bent to things, would want to say that the Roman Catholic Church was wrong about the Cathars, but that's not actually historically true. And looking it up, yeah, they didn't like the Cathars and they treated them as such, but we know what the Cathars believed, at least in general, and there's no deception there. All right. Next statement. This blogger says, the Bible was originally translated from Latin into English in 1611. Really? Really, the Bible was originally translated from Latin into English in 1611. Well, William Tyndale would be very surprised to find that out, because he translated from the Greek into English in 1526, for example. Wycliffe would be very surprised. He did translate from Latin, but he did that back in the 1300s, back in the 14th century. The Geneva translators would be very confused by that as well, because they translated in basically the middle of the 1500s, late middle of the 1500s. The Bible was not originally translated from Latin into English in 1611. The King James Version of the Bible was translated in 1611, basically. Well, technically it was started before that, but published in 1611. But yeah, not all English translations are the King James. And even the King James was not translated from the Latin. It was translated from Hebrew and Greek, and what they called the Chaldee, the Aramaic, with a lot of input from the Latin for sure. But no, there are lots of English translations that predate the King James 1611, and the vast majority of them were actually translated from Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The only major English translation at the time that I'm aware of that was actually translated from Latin, and it's not really at the time, it was a couple of centuries preceding, century or two preceding, was the Wycliffe Bible. That one actually was translated from Latin, but pretty much all the ones that came afterwards were not. Latin still had a big influence, but their texts that they were translating from were not Latin texts predominantly. So yeah, again, that's just really, 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 really historically ignorant. And then this blogger goes on to say this original Bible contained 80 books, including the Apocrypha, which means hidden. We'll say that it contained 80 books for just the point of argument, although technically some of those things that are called books are actually parts of books that were not deemed to be original, and therefore they were separated out. So calling them a separate book is a little bit debatable. But again, we have this emphasis in Gnosticism where certain words have certain special meanings, and if you take them out of their historical context, you can make them seem really, really, really interesting. For example, the word Apocrypha here, which means hidden. And technically that actually is true. Apocrypha does mean hidden, but there's a historical context to that. And that historical context is found in that debate, that very ancient early debate between Orthodox historical biblical Christians and the Gnostics. And that debate winds up showing up in later generations of Christian writings. Where do they discuss the Bible? Where do they discuss the books that they have? One such example of that is found in the writings of Rufinus. And what I have here on the screen is from Rufinus's, which one is this one? This is his commentary on the Apostles' Creed. Specifically, this is section 38. This is what Rufinus says. And by the way, Rufinus was a 4th going into 5th century author. And by the time that he's writing, most of the major debates between biblical, historical Christians and the Gnostics have largely been settled. It doesn't mean that the Gnostics are nowhere to be found. There's still Gnostic groups around. There's Gnostic groups around today. But in terms of the evaluation of the core argumentation and knowing where everybody stands, that was pretty well decided by this point. So this is a nice summary of basically after things were settled and done, where people came out on. And in describing the books of the Bible that we have, he goes through and he lists basically the books that we have in our modern English translations. And then in addition to that, in section 38, he says, but it should be known that there are also other books which our fathers call not canonical, the 66 books that we have today basically, but ecclesiastical. That is to say, wisdom, called the Wisdom of Solomon, and another wisdom, called the Wisdom of the son of Sirach, which last mentioned the Latins called by the general title Ecclesiasticus, designating not the author of the book, but the character of the writing. To the same class belong the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, and the books of the Maccabees. In the New Testament, the little book which is called the book of the pastor of Hermas, and that which is called the Two Ways, or the Judgments of Peter, all of which they would have read in the churches, but not appealed to for the confirmation of doctrine. The other writings they have named Apocrypha. These they would not have read in the churches. That term Apocrypha, Rufinus uses to describe everything that's outside of this category. So he first mentions the 66 books that we typically have, and then he mentions these ecclesiastical books that include things like the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, the Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, those kinds of things. And then in addition to that, he says there are also other books that are Apocrypha. But these they would not have read in the churches. Why is that? Well, as the blogger said, the word Apocrypha does mean hidden. And historically, that title of being hidden was associated with the Gnostics. The Gnostics made their own books. For example, we have the Proto-Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, and I think the Gospel of Philip is in that category as well. Pretty much everything in the Nag Hammadi library, which is a collection of all these Gnostic writings that were found at later dates. Most of them date to around the 4th century in terms of when they were collected and put together and basically buried in the ground and forgotten until they were later on discovered. The Gnostics produced a lot of writings, and early Orthodox Christians were very well aware of these other writings, and their term for them was Apocrypha, meaning hidden, because that's what the Gnostics taught about them. The Gnostics were the ones who called them hidden. The Gnostics were the ones who were saying, this is secret knowledge that the main guys over there don't want you to know, but we have the secret stuff, and we'll share it with you, because, we're cool dudes like that. Peace. That was what the Gnostics were saying, and so when the Orthodox Christians term something Apocrypha, they're saying it belongs to that class of writings. It belongs to them. It is the stuff that they made up out of the blue that has no history backing it. Our stuff has history backing it. The canon is the proper Word of God from the prophets of God. The ecclesiastical books, while they're not from the prophets of God, they are books that have meaning in the ecclesia, in the church. That's what ecclesiastical refers to. They're church books. They're not necessarily from prophets, but they are church books that are of church value. So they contain history. They give good advice, so on and so forth. They're not from prophets, they're not the official Word of God, but there's a utility that the church has for these kinds of books. And the other books, those are Apocrypha. These are the books that come from the Gnostics, basically, was their term for it. These are the hidden ones, those ones that the people out there, those Gnostics, are claiming is secret hidden knowledge. Yeah, those are theirs that they made up. It's not from us. Apocrypha was a pejorative term on the lips of an Orthodox Christian. If they referred to something as Apocrypha, they're saying, oh, it's like one of those Gnostic books that people were making up. Yeah, it was not a compliment at all. It was a put down. And in around this time period, a little shortly after, you have people like Jerome using that same term to refer to some of the books that the church had been accepting, like Ecclesiasticus and that. When Jerome called those books Apocrypha, again, it was as a pejorative, saying that these are really unreliable. Because Jerome, actually went to Israel and he learned Hebrew from the Jews. And he said, yeah, in the Hebrew, these books don't exist there. Because of that, they're unreliable. And so he treated those extra books basically as if they had no standing at all. They were as repugnant to him as the apocryphal books that the Gnostics had created were. And so he called those books Apocrypha as a pejorative. They weren't originally called that. They originally were called ecclesiastical, as Rufinus says. Later on, by Jerome, they got called Apocrypha. And that is the name that Protestants wound up accepting as well. For example, in the 1583 Geneva Bible, which is a Protestant Bible, it does include those extra books in a separate section. There would be the Old Testament and the New Testament, and between the two testaments, they would put these books that Rufinus calls the ecclesiasticals, that Jerome, as a put down, called the Apocrypha, and the name kind of stuck, and so the Protestants used it too. And they put in this middle section because at the time you could not legally publish a Bible without these books being in there. It's not because they necessarily wanted to have them there. It's because they were basically required to. You could not publish a Bible unless it had these books in it. So the Protestant solution was, well, we don't really regard these books, just like Jerome really didn't regard these books because they're not actually in the original languages. But we're required to have them in there. And yes, the church has used them in the past. So we'll go ahead and we'll explain. We'll set them aside so that people know that they're not a part of the Old Testament and they're not a part of the New Testament. They're all in their own little category in the middle. And then they also would usually put a forward similar to the forward that you have here, explaining what these books were about. And so this is the argument, and you notice the argument is spelt with a V instead of a U in older forms of modern English. Okay, they didn't use the same letters that we use in modern English. They use different letters and different sounds for them. And it says, these books, notice the these is spelt basically with an F. It's pronounced as an S, but it looks like an F. These books that follow, talking about the Apocrypha, in order after the prophets unto the New Testament, prophets being a reference for the Old Testament, after the prophets unto the New Testament are called Apocrypha. That is, books which are not received by a common consent to be read and expounded publicly in the church, neither yet serve to prove any point of Christian religion, save inasmuch as they had the consent of the other scriptures called canonical to confirm the same, or rather whereon they were grounded, but as books proceeding from godly men were received to be read for the advancement and furtherance of the knowledge of the history and for the instruction of godly manners, which books declare that all times God had an especial care of his church and left them not utterly destitute of teachers and means to confirm them in the hope of the promised Messiah. And also, I think that's witness that those calamities that God sent to his church were according to his providence, who had both so threatened by his prophets and so brought it to pass for the destruction of their enemies and for the trial of his children. So what the early Protestants are saying here in the Geneva Bible, and this is the 1583 Geneva Bible, what the early Protestants are saying is very similar to what Rufinus was saying. Rufinus said, okay, these are some books that are ecclesiastical. They're of value to the church. There's history in them. There is wisdom in them. There's instruction in them. But they're not canonical. They're not authoritative. What was it that Rufinus has said? He said, all of which we would have read in the churches, but not appealed to for the confirmation of doctrine. What is it that the Reformed Protestants has said? They said they neither yet serve to prove any point of Christian religion. Okay, so these don't prove any vital point of Christianity, but they're useful history, they're useful wisdom, they can be instructive, but they are not a source of doctrine for us. That was what was said in the past by Rufinus. That's what was said by Protestants in the future. That's what these books were historically. They were books that were useful to the church, but they were not authoritative for the church. That's where those books come from. And that's also why in early English translations, because the early English translations were made by Protestants, at least predominantly, and they wanted to make sure that people recognize the distinction in these books. These are not authoritative like the other ones, but they can still be useful, and since we're legally required to have them in there, we'll give them their own little section and say, this isn't where your doctrine comes from, but there is some good history here, there is some wisdom here, etc., etc. All right, so the Apocrypha, which means hidden. Hidden by who? Well, hidden originally by the Gnostics, who had their secret knowledge over in a corner. Hey, want to see the real story of Jesus? I've got this Gospel of Thomas. It's not like those other Gospels that you find from those Orthodox Christians, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No, this one's special. Well, it had been made up, and you can read the Gospel of Thomas, and it's very obvious that it was made up compared to the four Gospels that we know from the canon. The Gospel of Thomas is strange. It's basically a list of sayings. It takes Jesus and completely divorces him of any meaningful historical and geographical context. The Gospel of Thomas does not really concern itself with geographical place names to any great extent. It doesn't actually concern itself to any great extent with events that is going on in the life of Jesus and the disciples. It's basically just conversations and little statements. It's not actually a work that is rooted in history at all. It's not a historical work. Have a fundamentally and foundationally different character than the actual historical Gospels that actually do record the life and ministry of Jesus and put him in a particular geographic setting and actually record key events that are going on in his and the disciples' lives. Vastly different between the two. I'm not at all recommending that you shouldn't read the Gospel of Thomas. Go ahead and read it if you want to, and you'll see what I'm saying. There is a marked difference between those early Gnostic writings and the Orthodox writings. The Orthodox writings were obsessed with history, and they were obsessed with reality, and they were obsessed with actual, real, historical, true events. Gnostic writings, on the other hand, generally, by and large, were not. They show very little awareness of geography of Israel, or even any interest in the geography of Israel, where these things happened. And events are not big things to them because it's all about knowledge, it's all about philosophy. So historical realities of who Jesus was and did, what did he think? And granted, even Orthodox Christians would say it's important to know what Jesus thought, but that existed within a historical context. For Orthodox Christians, if there's no historical reality to who Jesus is, then what he thought about something isn't of any particular interest. For the Gnostics, on the other hand, the history is just a bunch of, we don't really care about that. We would like to think about what Jesus may have thought, or supposedly thought, etc., etc. And they had their hidden secret writings that would take out to show you what the real truth was, when everybody else who had looked at this stuff from the beginning said, no, you're making stuff up. We are the churches that were founded by the apostles. We are the church in Rome that was founded by Paul and Peter. We are the church in Alexandria that was founded by Mark. We are the church in Jerusalem that was founded by all the apostles that were around there. We're the church in Antioch that was founded by Paul the missionary. We are the historical churches. We know which books were actually circulated and the character of those books that were circulated by the original followers of Jesus. And you guys don't have that. So when the early Christians called the Gnostic writings Apocrypha, it was not a positive thing. That was a pejorative thing. So originally it was the Gnostic writings that were called Apocrypha, and then later on that term got applied to the ecclesiastical works like Judith and Tobit and Sirach and all those as a put down for them, saying that these shouldn't have any great standing with us because they're not in the original Hebrew, so on and so forth. The argument from Jerome. Okay, so does Apocrypha mean hidden? Yes. It means, and that was a put down against the Gnostics, who had secret hidden knowledge in their secret hidden writings that everybody who had actually been around for any amount of time knew were completely fabricated and false. Yeah, the whole thing about it being hidden is like, yeah, that's what you call it. Yeah, wasn't a good thing. All right, and then the author of this blog goes on to say, these Apocrypha books made up the end of the Old Testament. No, they didn't make up the end of the Old Testament. The Protestants very clearly said that these follow in order after the prophets unto the New Testament. They didn't consider it to be a part of the Old Testament. It was between the Testaments. Okay, it's not Old Testament, it's not New Testament. We're putting them there because chronologically that's where a lot of them fit. For example, the Maccabees are very much so between the two Testaments. Maccabees take place after the events of Malachi and Nehemiah and all that, and decidedly before Matthew. So historically, they're between the two Testaments, but they're not canon. They're not authoritative. They do not serve, as the Protestants said, they do not serve to prove any point of Christian religion, or as Rufinus put it, they should not be appealed to for the confirmation of doctrine. So no, they did not make up the end of the Old Testament. They're not authentic. Generally speaking, there were a great many Christians throughout history that did not consider them to be authentic or on the same par with the Old Testament. Now, there were some that were, and that's why there was confusion that developed around the time of the Protestant, that had developed up to the time of the Protestant Reformation. But even then, you had people who were on both sides of the issue. All right, and then the person lists the books, 1st and 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, the rest of Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, and the Epistle of Jeremiah, the Songs of the Three Holy Children. I don't know if it should be songs. I think it's just the Song of the Three Holy Children. History of Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, the Prayer of Manasseh, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. In some other Bibles, especially Eastern Orthodox Bibles, you'll also sometimes find 3rd and 4th Maccabees. You'll also find additional Psalms, at least the 151st Psalm. Some other Eastern versions will, I think, even go up to like 154, 155 Psalms. It varies a little bit because different groups had different ecclesiastical canons of things that the church used and found useful. And so what got attached to it would vary a little bit. And then this person claims that later in 1684, all of these books were removed from the Bible and all of its various versions. The only one left intact was the 1611 edition. Well, here is the 1583 Geneva that very clearly still has 1st Esdras in it. So, I mean, it still exists. And then going to a modern Bible, this is from a Catholic website. This is from Catholic.org. You can look up Wisdom, the Book of Wisdom, Wisdom of Solomon, and right now I have it open to chapter 2 because it's going to come up later on in the blog. But you can even go to modern Bibles, not from Protestants, but from Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and people like that, and you can find these books there. They didn't remove it from all Bibles. You can still find Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles that have it. You can find old Protestant Bibles that still have it. It's just modern Protestant Bibles that don't have it. And then about it being 1684, I have no idea where that comes from. You can find a lot of Bibles that were printed after 1684 and that still had the Apocrypha in them. So I'm not really sure what this is about. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not... 1684. I cannot think of any major event in 1684 that would have led to versions of the Bible being printed without the Apocrypha. I mean, historically, we know of cases where Bibles that were printed after that still had the Apocrypha. For example, Joseph Smith The founder of the Mormon religion was someone who had access to a King James Bible with the Apocrypha in it. And Joseph Smith doesn't come onto the scene until the 1800s. So yeah, there had to have been Bibles with the Apocrypha intact up until that point. I mean, historically we know that they existed. The case of Joseph Smith is a good example of that. So where does 1684 come from? I have absolutely no idea where this person got that number. I do know that in the early 1800s, 1830s roughly, late 1820s going into the 1830s, there was a very massive missionary movement among Protestant Christians at the time. And that missionary movement was a mission to go out into basically the whole world as far as they could and proselytize the world. And in those cases, they started taking the Apocrypha out of the Bible because it made it easier to ship and take with them. If you are basically have to lug this thing around everywhere and you want to carry as many as you can for every convert, or at least every church that you plant, etc., etc. If you want to get as many Bibles out there as possible, but yet make it easy to ship and deal with, you want to make the book physically smaller, and the easiest way to do that is to get rid of extraneous material. And since they did not view the Apocrypha as being authoritative, as being determinative regarding Christian doctrine and life, that was a very obvious place to cut first. And so they cut out the Apocrypha, and they also cut a lot of notes that would appear in a lot of different versions of the Bible. They'd have notes in the margins. And of course, the more extra material that you have in there, the longer you're going to make the thing, and that means the bigger it is, and that means the heavier it is, and that the harder to ship it is. You know, if I'm going on a ship and I have 1,000 pounds worth of cargo space at my disposal, I can put 1,000 pounds on the ship without, the ship tipping over or whatnot. Well, 1,000 pounds of Bibles that have the Apocrypha intact is not going to be nearly as many Bibles as if I take out the Apocrypha. I can put more Bibles in there. So it was meant to save space, it was meant to save weight. But that really didn't begin to any great extent until, like I said, the early 1800s, 1820s, 1830s. So I'm not really sure where this number 1684 comes from. Yeah, and like I said, you can look at Joseph Smith and the things that he did, and he was very obviously aware of the Apocrypha, and he spoke of the Apocrypha, and that was very clearly after 1684. So, yeah, and he would have been reading from Protestant translations, not Catholic translations. So, yeah, I have no idea where this claim comes from. Totally bizarre to me. This blogger goes on to say, in this first edition Bible, I don't think there's supposed to be a comma there. In this first edition Bible, Jesus' name was spelled with an I, pronounced Yahushua. You have to wonder why it was changed to Jesus, contrary to the original pronunciation and spelling. Okay, this statement right here is just laughably absurd. First of all, we don't know what the original pronunciation or spelling was technically, because we don't have any originals. We don't have any originals in Hebrew. We don't have any originals in Greek. We don't have any originals in Aramaic, at least as far as we know. And it wasn't like they had MP3 recorders back then, so we don't know how they said any of this stuff. Now, there are educated guesses that people can make about how the Hebrew was originally pronounced and how the Greek was pronounced and all that, but there are educated guesses, and spelling is definitely one that changes. In the Greek New Testament manuscripts, for example, you will usually have different spellings of the same word within the same manuscript. One of the typical ones that this occurs with is the Greek name for the Apostle John, Yone, or Yanu, it depends on the inflected for. Yones could be spelled a variety of different ways. It wasn't really a fixed thing. And even in early English, spelling was not necessarily an overly fixed thing either. The idea of standardized spelling is something that really would pick up more in the 1700s going into the 1800s, where you get a lot of specialization, especially of the English language and the American English language. But before the advent of basically modern dictionaries that would tell people what a word was, how it was spelled, and what it meant, before you get that kind of standardization, people would spell things pretty much any old which way, and that goes all the way back into ancient times. Pronunciation and spelling could vary quite a bit. So saying that you know exactly how it was pronounced and how it was spelt is a bit of an egregious claim. But I love that this person thinks that spelling Jesus with an I somehow meant that it was pronounced Yahushua. That is laughably bad. Let me show you what I mean. Let's look at the 1557 Geneva Bible New Testament. 1557, they published basically just the New Testament. That's the first part of the Bible that they translated. So they published it separately, and then later when they had translated the rest of it, they put it together and it became the Geneva Bible. But in 1557, it was just the New Testament. And here in the Gospel of John, chapter 1 and verse 19, in the Geneva Bible, it translates John chapter 1, verse 19 this way. It says, "Then this is the record of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who art thou?'" Now you'll notice that it spells John, Jews, and Jerusalem with I, the letter I instead of the letter J. Do you honestly think that they looked at that and decided to add some extra syllables in there when they pronounced it? Because that's what this person does. Oh, it was spelled with an I, and therefore, instead of being 2 syllables, it is now, 3 or 4 syllables. Do you really think that the translators of the 1557 Geneva Bible New Testament meant for you to include an extra syllable or 2 in the name John, or in the ethnic title of Jew, or in Jerusalem? I don't think so. I don't think that is at all reasonable. As far as we can tell in English, and again, MP3 recordings didn't exist back then, but early modern English is certainly much closer to us than, say, ancient Hebrew or Greek or something like that. I think it's pretty reasonable to say that they would have pronounced those words sufficiently close to what we do today to say that even though they spelled it with an I, yeah, they probably meant John. Even though they spelled it with an I, they probably meant Jews. Even though they spelled it with an I, they probably meant Jerusalem. They didn't mean Jehonichinamaha. They didn't mean Jehusahaus and Jehuchakepashuminim. Probably didn't do that. No, they just simply spelt it with different letters. And even in this verse, you get another case where they use a different letter than we use. Levites, they spell with a U. Does that mean they pronounced it Levites? No, it was probably Levites. Okay, they just use different letters than we do, and that occurs in pretty much every language where the letters that are used will signify different sounds at different times in the history of that language. And they'll also spell things differently. I mean, take a look at how they spelled Jews and priests. There's an extra E in there that we don't have in American English. Does that mean that it was Jewes and priestes? No. It was Jews and it was priests. They just spelled it differently. They used different letters. That's a normal thing in history of languages in general. And if this person had actually spent any time in the original sources, in early English translations of the Bible, they would know that spelling things with I's was typical. Things that we would normally pronounce and spell with a J in modern American English, in early modern English, they would spell with an I instead. Doesn't mean that they added a bunch of extra syllables to it at all, though. Okay. If you'd read the other ones and took the time to actually look at early English translations, would have been a very different story, but obviously this person didn't do that because they don't know anything about history, which is just sad. And so Why was it changed to Jesus? It's because we pronounce the letter differently now. Our I's we pronounce as modern I's, I or E or something like that, depending on where it is and what word, and etc. But we don't pronounce it with a J sound anymore, so we use the letter that has that sound, J. It's not that hard, not that complicated. All right, and then this person goes on to say, one of the most interesting books of the removed was the Wisdom of Solomon. Solomon is one of the most legendary biblical figures from the Bible, as he was the son of David and the wisest man that ever lived. Okay, so we're going to learn something interesting about the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, like I said, if you know the history at all, you know that the Wisdom of Solomon was considered an ecclesiastical work originally, and later as a pejorative it was called Apocrypha, and that's the name that wound up sticking. That is, that early on this was not considered canonical. It was not considered to actually be from the prophets. It was not actually considered to be from Solomon. Okay, this isn't actually from Solomon. His name is attached to it, but that doesn't mean he actually wrote it. That's just what it was called in history. Okay, so is this actually significant? No. Not at all, any more than people who say they found, the diary of Abraham Lincoln, in which he uses the words dude and cool and spectacularly fabulous man. Would you believe that that's actually an authentic diary of Abraham Franklin if you have someone using more modern slang in it? Probably not. Same basic issue with the Wisdom of Solomon. It's not found in the original Hebrew. Its style and composition and verbiage is markedly different from authentic writings from that time period. It's really not from Solomon. Okay, but does this person seem to understand that about the history of the document? No. It was removed, and so it's secret and it's hidden, so it has some secret hidden message for us. So let's go ahead and look at that. It's no more authoritative than the diary of Abraham. Just had the name, sorry. But yeah, you know what I mean. Now it's going to bug me. I missed the name. Abraham Lincoln, there we go. It's no more authoritative than something that claims to be the diary of Abraham Franklin that is written with more modern words like dude and cool used in the more modern usage. Wouldn't be any more authoritative, or if in this supposed diary of Abraham Franklin we had them talking about texting. Probably not at least the same Abraham Franklin, just saying. It's kind of the same thing with the Wisdom of Solomon, but has this person done the history to know that that was the case? To know that even early Christians like Rufinus didn't consider the Wisdom of Solomon to actually be authentic? To know that Jerome rejected it because it wasn't a part of the original Hebrew, so on and so forth? No. It's a secret hidden book, therefore it has a secret hidden message for us, so let's get out the secret decoder ring and look at it. So this person goes on and says, typically, speaking of Solomon, he is portrayed as a benevolent figure. Typically portrayed as benevolent. Depends on who you're talking to. To someone who's relatively ignorant of Christian history, maybe. Someone who knows a little bit more about who Solomon was biblically, and the fact that his successors talked about the fact that he could be rather harsh and whatnot in the Bible. That's not how the Bible necessarily portrays Solomon. The Bible actually portrays him as being fairly severe. So if you're talking, so again, whoever this is meant to be aimed towards, it's not someone who's biblically literate and a critical thinker. Alright, so typically he, being Solomon, is portrayed as a benevolent figure. However, this book will change everything that you ever learned about him. No, it will not, because it's not actually from Solomon. It's no different from a diary, supposed diary of Abraham Lincoln that talks about texting. It's not authentic. It doesn't change anything about what we know about Abraham Lincoln. Did you know that Abraham Lincoln really liked to text his friends, especially on Saturday morning? Wow! You're a special one. This person goes on to say, for example, read this expert, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 1 through 24. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we're getting really long on time here, but I will read the first verse because it's germane to what comes afterwards. The first verse says, "For the ungodly said," this is a quote, "For the ungodly said," and in older versions of English, early modern English, and early English translations, they usually wouldn't put in the quotation marks like we have in modern English, because punctuation was not as big of a thing back then as it is now. And actually, as you go further back in history, the less and less punctuation you get. For example, in the Greek New Testament manuscripts, you basically don't have punctuation. There's a few punctuation marks, but they don't show up very often. It's basically a continuous string of letters, no spaces between words, no periods, no commas, nothing like that. It's just a continuous string of letters for the most part. There's, like I said, a few little marks here and there, but for the most part, it's just a continuous string of letters. And over time, punctuation developed into being a bit of a thing. But that kind of punctuation to mark off quotations and stuff like that didn't come along until later. So in early translations, you will have quotations that are introduced just by saying so-and-so said. In this case, it says the ungodly person said, reasoning with themselves. Okay, that's a commentary on what is about to come, but that word said introduces that a quote is going to follow, reasoning with themselves, but not aright, so they're not rightly reasoning with themselves. And then the quote starts. Our life is short and tedious, and in the death of a man there is no remedy, neither was there any man known to have returned from the grave. And everything that follows after that is a continuation of that quote. The verse divisions that we have in the Bible, and even at the time, were not the ends of thoughts. Those were just markers in the text to help you find a particular place. That's all that they were. This thought continues into verse 2, for we are born at all adventure, and we shall be hereafter as though we had never been. This is still the ungodly person talking. So this is a hypothetical ungodly person if you read the entire context. Hypothetical ungodly person, and this is the kinds of things that an ungodly person says. That's the idea behind chapter 2 of the Wisdom of Solomon. Okay, I wanted to point that out because that actually is not the author of the Wisdom of Solomon speaking. And also, as I said, the Wisdom of Solomon was not actually written by Solomon. Just like a supposed diary from Abraham Lincoln that talks about texting is not from Abraham Lincoln. It's the same kind of thing going on. So this, first of all, is not from Solomon, and second, this part that follows, going all the way down here, is not the author of the Wisdom of Solomon speaking. It's the hypothetical ungodly person that is saying this stuff. For the ungodly said, reasoning within themselves but not aright. Then the quote starts, our life is short and tedious, da-da-da-da-da, and the rest of it is the quote of the ungodly person, not of the author. This person, whoever wrote this article, is frankly illiterate. Has very clearly not read early English translations enough to know how they introduce quotes, and that they don't introduce quotes with commas and quotation marks like we do in modern English. Because this person is going to go on to say, why did Solomon sound so crazy and evil in this book? After going through all the verses, this person says, why did Solomon sound so crazy and evil in this book? First of all, Solomon didn't write it. It was just in his name. It's pseudepigraphical. And this isn't even the author that is saying this. This is the hypothetical ungodly person. This isn't Solomon. Okay. That's the kind of article that we have here that doesn't even recognize those basic, simple things. Now, ending the quote, we'll go ahead and go back to the end of the quote. So verse 20 ends, let us condemn him with a shameful death, for by his own mouth he shall be respected. It's interesting that the quote was supposed to go through verse 24, but in actuality it ends in verse 20, but and then the author of the blog goes on to say, these verses bring to mind a few different important questions, such as, who is Solomon speaking of killing with a shameful death? Again, it's not Solomon, it's the hypothetical ungodly person. Next question, why did the Vatican vote to have these 14 books removed from the Bible? They didn't. You can go to Catholic sources like Catholic.org. You can go to their Bible, which will include the Wisdom of Solomon. You can look up chapter 2, the very passage that we're talking about, and it will give you a modern translation of it. They did not vote to remove it. It's still in their Bibles. The Roman Catholics like these books. It wasn't them that took it out. There were early Christians who didn't think that they were authentic, and later on the Protestant reformers also didn't think that they were authentic. Those are the people who took it out. Wasn't the Catholics. The Catholics still have them. And then the question that I mentioned before, why did Solomon sound so crazy and evil in this book? Because it wasn't Solomon, and the crazy evil person was the hypothetical ungodly person. So, yeah. This person goes on to say, it seems that Solomon was speaking of Jesus. That is actually the exact same claim that the Catholics make as to why these books should be accepted, because they clearly speak of Jesus. Again, context says this is a hypothetical ungodly person talking about the hypothetical righteous person. And a hypothetical righteous person is, of course, going to be righteous, and Jesus was righteous, but that's about where the connection ends. Let's see here. And then this person goes on to say, but Jesus was born roughly 900 years after his death. Could he have prophesied Jesus coming? If you believe the canonical books of the Bible, you do believe in prophecy, and prophecy that can happen hundreds of years beforehand, because yes, the Bible does contain prophecies about Jesus. So I'm not sure why that's significant. This person goes on to say, let's consider why this could be who Solomon was talking about. And then it goes back and it references things that happened in that particular section of the Wisdom of Solomon. They killed the son with a shameful death. The son's actions or fashions were different from everybody else's. He claims to be and is the child of the Most High. By the way, that was not exclusive terminology. Anyone who did what was right before God could be called a child of the Most High and a son of God. It was a title of righteousness. It wasn't necessarily a title of deity. Just pointing that out. He was a righteous poor man who would look at Solomon and others like him as counterfeits. No, he wasn't looking at Solomon and others like him as counterfeits. He was looking at the hypothetical ungodly person as counterfeits. He professeth to have knowledge of the Most High. Yes, every person who is righteous would do so by knowledge of the Most High. That's not significant. Then this person goes on to say, then listen to what Solomon has to say. He was made to reprove, criticize our thoughts, speaking of the hypothetical righteous person in contradistinction to the ungodly person. We are esteemed of him as counterfeits. He abstaineth from our ways. As from filthiness, he pronounceth the end of the just to be blessed, and maketh his boast that God is his Father. Again, that's not exclusive language. For if the just man be the son of the Most High, he will help him and deliver him from the hands of his enemies. Again, that's not exclusive language. And one last thing I would like to point out is when Solomon says, let us oppress the poor righteous man, let us not spare the widow, nor reverence the ancient gray hairs of the age, in contradiction to everything most of us know and believe about Solomon. In these verses, he sounds completely evil. No. First of all, this is not actually written by Solomon. Just as a supposed diary from Abraham Lincoln that talks about texting wasn't really from Abraham Lincoln. Same thing here. But even at that, in the context of the original passage, it clearly states at the beginning that this is what the ungodly person said. This is not the author of the work, and it's certainly not Solomon. According to most biblical teachings in modern times, we are told to believe that he is the wisest man in the history of the world. Okay. Not sure how that's overly relevant, but okay. It should be noted that Solomon was largely involved in the occult. Really? Let's see what their justification is for that claim. Much of the knowledge and teachings that Aleister Crowley preached about were based on the Lesser Keys of Solomon, which is another apocryphal work. Well, it's not even apocryphal. It's way outside of anything that would be even remotely close to Orthodox Christianity. Again, not authentic. It's the same thing as having the diary that mentions texting from Abraham Lincoln. It's just not authentic at all. And then it goes on to say Solomon worshipped multiple gods and had a weakness for women. That's not exactly what the Bible says. The Bible definitely said that Solomon had many wives and that he built temples for his wives so that they could worship their gods, because they would usually be foreign women with from countries with whom Solomon had made agreements to get the wives and whatnot. So there's a certain amount of it that was political, and he did accommodate them by making temples to their gods. But the Bible doesn't say that he actually engaged in it. He obviously condoned it, and he was wrong for doing that, for allowing it to happen. But that doesn't mean that he necessarily worshipped those gods. Most of the indication that we have, in the Bible at least, is that Solomon actually was fairly faithful. There were some things that he did that was obviously wrong, like allowing his wives to worship false gods. But as for what he himself did, it doesn't seem that he was overly unfaithful. At least not to justify the claim that he did in fact worship multiple gods. I can't think of a single actual biblical canonical passage that could be used to justify that specific claim, at least not directly. Right, then this person goes on to say, it is also worth mentioning that the Temple of Solomon is considered the spiritual birthplace of Freemasonry, which is a secret society of sorts that has been responsible for much of the corruption taking place in our world today. So we have a very Gnostic bent to this whole blog, and then we go right into Freemasonry. So this is basically a combination of Gnosticism and conspiracy theories. Great to know. Problem, though, is that Freemasonry does not exist before the 1700s. It doesn't. It does not come into existence before then. There is no mention of it as being Freemasonry as we would understand it today before the 1700s. It was something that came about in time, at a fairly late time, and people who were in it liked to claim that it had ancient roots, but none of those claims are actually in any historically meaningfully justifiable way present. They're just not. It's basically the same thing as with Mormonism. In Mormonism, you have the claim that there was an ancient group of Israelites that traveled over to the Americas. And they lived and worked and did their thing for hundreds of years until basically eventually they died off. But they left a record buried in the ground, something secret and hidden, something Gnostic. But the problem with that claim is that there is just no evidence that the supposed events in the Americas of these Jews that traveled away from Israel and wound up in the Americas, there is no corroborating evidence of any significant import. You look at any of the place names, say in the Book of Mormon, and try to correlate them with anything in the Americas that we have today, and none of them can be verified. Unlike the Bible, where we can talk about places like, say, Jerusalem, and you can go to Jerusalem today and you can say, hey, this is Jerusalem, and you can do excavations and say, hey, here's stuff that happened in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a real place. This is the actual name of the place. We understand, how it comes from the ancient Hebrew and eventually gets translated into English as Jerusalem. There's a history there. There's a place name that we can attach with that actually existed in history. That doesn't exist for Mormonism. There are all these place names that are in the Book of Mormon, but not a single one of them can be verified for any place in the Americas. It doesn't exist. It is a false claim. They like to claim that they have ancient roots that they don't really have, and this is pretty typical of most Gnostic groups in general. We have this secret knowledge of what is really true. Well, how do you know that it's really true? Oh, we were there at the beginning. We were really there. We really know our stuff. No. If you were really there at the beginning, there would be a record of it. And if there isn't a record of it, I'm not obligated to believe a thing that you say. You can claim it all you want, and maybe in some cases you could be right. It is possible for records to not exist in the present that did exist in the past. That is technically possible. But no wise person, I'm going to posit, would believe a claim without any substantiating evidence that would be necessary. That's one of the basic tenets of any kind of historical corroboration, is that if you mention place names, that, at least some of those place names for a given location need to actually exist in order to corroborate at least some of the story. A wise person would look at that. And in the case of Freemasonry, you don't actually have historical mentions of Freemasonry in any verifiably meaningful way until the 1700s. Now, Freemasonry didn't come out of absolutely nothing. You can go back even into the 1400s of basic craftsman guilds that would have different ceremonies and whatnot that Freemasonry seemed to come out of. But in any way resemblant of what we have today, no, that's 1700s and later. Freemasonry does not go back to the Temple of Solomon. Regardless of what the Freemasons want to claim about themselves, it's not true. It's no more true than the Mormons claiming that there were a group of Jews that traveled to the Americas and lived here for hundreds of years without leaving a discernible trace. No, it's not true. That doesn't mean that the Freemasons aren't a thing, and it doesn't mean that they don't have influence, but frankly, they tell tall tales just like the Mormons tell tall tales. If there isn't any good historical verifiable data from for certain points, it probably means that they didn't exist before that point. Just saying. Okay. But people who are gullible, who will believe conspiracy theories without actual verification, they'll believe stuff like this. Then this person goes on to say, it has never been stated for sure, and by the way, I'm not saying that there isn't any such thing as Freemasonry that can't have a negative impact in the world. Okay, what we do know of the Freemasons in the modern world is, probably not a good thing. But to say that to believe their lies, that they really are this ancient order that goes all the way back to the Temple of Solomon and whatnot, no, don't believe their lies. Question them, question the people who would repeat their lies. They're not as ancient as they claim. All right, and then this person goes on to say, it has never been stated for sure as to why these books were removed from the Bible. Because they weren't. The Catholics didn't remove them. You can go to Catholic.org, look up the Bible, and you can find these books there. They haven't been removed. So why would they say why they've been removed? If you want to know why Protestants remove them from their Bibles, go to Protestant sources like the 1583 Geneva Bible that did have the Apocrypha in it, and understand what the Protestant position on the Apocrypha was. The Protestant position was that these books are books that should not be used to prove any point of Christian religion. They're not canonical, and therefore they are negligible. You can leave them off without affecting any point of Christian religion. Doesn't mean that they don't have any historical significance. It doesn't mean that there isn't any wisdom contained in them, but they don't prove any point of Christian religion, no point of doctrine, therefore they're negligible, and that is borne out by historical statements from Christians like Rufinus. These are not to be appealed to for the confirmation of doctrine. That is why they eventually wound up getting left out of most modern Protestant translations of the Bible. Okay, there's no question here. This is what happened. Why were these books removed from the Bible? We don't know. Yes, we do. First of all, when it comes to the Catholics, it wasn't removed. They still have them. As to why the Protestants removed them, we know that why the Protestants removed them was because they didn't hold them in high esteem. This isn't a mystery. This is someone who is grossly ignorant of the facts coming up with things. And then they say, although various speculations have been made. So far, the author of this blog is the only person who's speculating anything. People who have actually read the history and actually read the books and read the early English Bibles know exactly what happened with the Apocrypha. That's not a mystery at all. They're not speculating. Only this person is speculating. This person goes on to say, we have to wonder if something darker isn't behind their removal and what exactly they are hiding away with these books. They're not hidden away. That was a pejorative term. To call it Apocrypha, to call it hidden, was to saying that it's Gnostic, to saying that it's fabricated, to say that it's made up. It doesn't mean that they were hidden from sight and no one could ever see them again. No, they get referenced multiple times in history. For people who actually look into original sources and know them, they have access to them. In fact, in my suitcase, go ahead and grab it here. I happen to have a modern translation of the Old Testament from the Greek, because there actually is a Greek version of the Old Testament, commonly called the Septuagint, a New English translation of the Septuagint, and in this New English translation of the Septuagint, it includes the apocryphal books. So you can see things. They're kind of towards the middle of what I'm looking at. You have 1st and 2nd Esdras. You have Esther. You have Judith. You have Tobit. You have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. Yeah. They're not hidden. For anyone who actually knows the history of the Bible and why certain groups of books were categorized certain ways, they know that they're there. They're easily available. You can get this on Amazon. I think that's where I got this one. A New English translation of the Septuagint. Look it up. It's not hidden. The claim that it's hidden is just a woefully ignorant statement. Okay, it's not hidden. It's available. You can read it if you want to. Okay. And then this person goes on to say, typically when something is removed from our direct sight by those in power, they don't expect us to look any deeper than the surface. No, you're the person who didn't look any deeper than the surface. If you actually look into it and get these resources and look at original sources, it's not a mystery. There's no secret hidden thing going on here. We know what these were. We know what they were about. We know why the Protestants didn't like them. We know why the Catholics liked them, and that was because the Protestants didn't like them. Some Catholic doctrines are literally just that. The Protestants said they were going this way, and so the Catholics said they were going that way. That is all the historical justification there is to some Catholic beliefs. Well, we can't do what the Protestants are doing, so the Protestants don't like these books, so we love them. But up until that point, the Catholics actually didn't really have a strong opinion on the books one way or the other. Until the Protestants came along and said, no, we should probably leave those behind. We should not use those in any major concerted way. And then the Catholics took notice. Okay, well, now we need to have an official statement on this. And that's basically where the Council of Trent came in. The Council of Trent is what solidified those books for the Catholics. So they say, no, we need to have the Book of Tobit. We need to have the Book of Judith. Okay, they still have them. Protestants don't. This article reverses that, and it's because this article is ignorant. The author of this article is ignorant. Well, the article is pretty ignorant too, but that's another story. But when we do, there's almost always more to uncover than we would have ever imagined. Well, in the sense of some secret, cool thing that just explains the universe away, not really. Most actual history is fairly mundane and not overly exciting, and it doesn't tell you, Harry, that you're a wizard. No, most of the time it says that there were disagreements in history, usually for fairly obvious reasons, like books that were falsely attributed, on par with a supposed diary from Abraham Lincoln that mentions texting, very clearly falsely attributed works that existed in history that some people liked and other people said, no, this is stupid, we're not doing that. Fairly mundane stuff. Okay? You are not a wizard, Harry. Okay. No secret, greatly hidden agenda here. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't bad things that happen in the world. It doesn't mean that there aren't plots and conspiracies that actually do exist and are real. But as far as what this article has to provide, this is just sad. This is just really, really, really sad, written by someone who's clearly excessively ignorant of Christian history, trying to interest people who are similarly ignorant of Christian history in something that is ultimately Gnostic and not at all in keeping with the biblical gospel. I really shouldn't have to explain all this, but unfortunately we live in a day and an age where people are not nearly as concerned with truth as they should be. They don't investigate things like they should. Looking at original sources is saying, hey, let's look at some early English Bibles. Let's look up early English Bibles and see what they actually looked like, and see if we can get some facsimiles so I can actually read how it was written back then and what letters they used and those kinds of things, how they spelled things. That desire to actually look into things in a meaningful way and be logical and reasonable, sadly very lacking right now, and winds up in these kinds of articles. It's sad that I have to do that. It's sad that it needs to be said, but it's the reality that we're dealing with. So it is what it is. In any case, thank you, everyone, whether you're for or against what I've said here, or whether it's relevant to you or not. Thank you for listening. And for those of you who are in Christ, I pray that you would be blessed. And for those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history. Not the one that's made up or supposed by people. Not the Gnostic Jesus, the one that never actually existed. I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.